Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, May 13th. I'm Katy Balls, the Spectator's Deputy Political Editor, and I'll be your host this week, standing in for Andrew Neil. On this week's jam-packed show, Labour have some soul-searching to do after the local election results. Andrew Adonis, a minister in Tony Blair's government, and Paul Embery, a columnist for Unherd, will be on to debate Labour's future. Could a new leader be the answer to Labour's prayers? Andy Burnham, the Greater Manchester mayor, is now the bookies' favourite to be the party's next leader. He joins me to discuss what went wrong, where the party needs a new direction, and why he's just started a column in the London Evening Standard. Then looking north of the border, I'll speak to our home team, Fraser and James, about this week's cover story. Does Nicola Sturgeon really want a second referendum now? COVID will come next. Kate Andrews will go through the latest data coming in, and Rachel Johnson will be on hand to talk about the new rules of post-pandemic conversation. We'll finish on the French presidential elections, where I'll speak to Spectator contributor Jonathan Miller, along with Freddie Gray, about whether Michel Barnier, the infamous Brexit negotiator, has any chance of winning. All that to come in the next hour. Before we get going, if you enjoy what we do at Spectator TV, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the button at the bottom of the video and then tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. And if you want to subscribe to the magazine, we have a special offer for you. Get 12 issues of the magazine plus a £20 Amazon voucher for just £12. Go to www.spectator.co.uk/TV offer to take it up. Now first, the local elections were the first real test of Keir Starmer's leadership, and it wasn't good. The Tories took control of another dozen councils and got an extra 200 councillors elected. So what's gone wrong for the party? Is this part of a wider political realignment, or would a new leader do the trick? I'm joined now by Andrew Adonis, a minister in Tony Blair's government, along with Paul Embery, a current Labour member, a lifelong Labour member, and a former executive at the Fire Brigades Union, also an Unherd columnist. Paul, what's your diagnosis of what went wrong in Hartlepool?
Well, what went wrong is that the Labour Party has increasingly, over recent years, become a middle-class pressure group, and the old coalition on which the party was based and on which it enjoyed much of its success was Hartlepool and Hampstead. It was, yes, a layer of middle-class, white-collar people who supported Labour's ideas of a more egalitarian economy, but also the blue-collar working-class base. And places like Hartlepool in provincial and post-industrial Britain just look at the Labour Party nowadays and think, actually, you don't look like me, you don't sound like me, you don't share my priorities. You tried to overturn the referendum result when we voted leave. Why should we vote for you? So there's a huge disconnect, which has been entirely self-inflicted by the Labour Party.
And Paul, do you think the choice of candidate played a role in this? Because much to be made of the fact they were someone who had supported a second referendum.
I think the choice of candidate obviously wasn't ideal. I mean, Paul Williams was an Uber Remainer, and in a constituency that voted 70% Leave. And in many of these places, by the way, people are still brimming with anger at the Labour Party over the fact that they tried to overturn their vote. But the problem is Labour wasn't exactly spoilt for choice. This is the problem for the Labour Party. That old working class element, which was once the backbone of the party, people had come up through the trade union movement, people had worked in manual labour, people who were based in blue-collar constituencies and were part of the Labour movement. They're just not there in any serious number anymore. So I would imagine if Labour did want to select a Leave candidate for Hartlepool, it would have had a pretty hard job to find someone. That's the problem.
So do you think, Andrew, that the choice of a pro-Remain candidate in a seat that voted 70% for Brexit was a big factor in this, or not?
No, I don't think it was at all. And indeed, I think it swings and roundabouts for the candidate. Paul Williams is a local GP, and he was in many ways an extremely attractive candidate. The Tory candidate came from Yorkshire, and anyone who knows Hartlepool and Teesside knows that the only thing worse than having somebody from Hampstead is somebody from Yorkshire. So the idea that the candidates, the local candidates, played a role, I don't think is correct. I think, as I say, the two people on the ballot paper in Hartlepool were Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, and they went for Boris Johnson. And the history of elections, if you look at polling, all the way back to the beginning of polling is that almost without exception, the party that wins elections is the party that has the more popular leader. And in the head-to-head on the leadership stakes at the moment, it's Boris Johnson, not Keir Starmer.
Paul?
I disagree profoundly with Andrew that this is essentially just really a question of leadership. This is not a question of leadership. Changing the leader in the Labour Party at the moment would essentially be reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. This is a question about the Labour Party's DNA. This is a question about the culture, about the structure of the Labour Party. It runs far wider than questions of leadership and party management. And the idea that all we need to do is return to, some sort of reheated Blairism, I think that, for all that parts of his essay were right in the New Statesman this week, Tony Blair, show a bit of humility. And I think Andrew needs to show a bit of humility. It was that kind of Blairite embrace of the global market and everything that went with it, the loose immigration policy. It was the promotion of cosmopolitan liberalism over everything else, which alienated blue-collar communities in the first place. For all the good that New Labour did, it completely failed to understand the communitarian impulse in many of those communities. People's desire for social solidarity, their desire for stability, a sense of belonging, the acute effects that globalisation had in the first decade of this century cannot be overestimated. And what Blairism did effectively is it laid in train what we're seeing now in terms of the woke agenda, where the liberal left effectively just demonised millions of working class people as racist and nativist. We saw it in Brexit, we saw it well before Brexit, and that anger was storing up for years in these communities, and I know it because I lived in one.
Andrew, do you think it's time that you should show some humility? Paul mentions that Tony Blair article in the New Statesman this week where he says the party has gone too far when it comes to the so-called woke end, but surely that does link back to the Blair era to a degree.
Well, Paul sprayed so many different claims and allegations, it's very hard to get a handle on it. And in particular, it's almost impossible to get a sense of where you would go in future on what he said, because he thinks that Corbyn wasn't the answer. He thinks that Blair wasn't the answer. He thinks we've both, on the one hand, been too woke, whereas in fact, actually, Tony, if you read his article, has a critique of the problem of Labour being seen to be extremist on some of those issues. All I would make is two observations. Labour won 3 elections when Tony Blair was leader, and it swept all of the areas we're talking about. It held almost all of the seats in the northeast when he was leader, and that includes in his 3rd election. So to blame him for what happened 15 years later, I think is just straightforwardly unhistorical. And though times change, approaches don't change, and the big problem that Labour has is it does not have a leadership that is capable of appealing to the north and south. Now, of course, it's true that a leader has to have policies and ideas. This idea, though, that the policies and ideas of Blair were somehow the destructive of community and social progress, though, again, is completely unhistorical. It was that Labour government that substantially rebuilt the public services, massive investment in health, education. Remember, Tony Blair's mantra was education, education, education. A huge expansion of opportunity. The big problem in communities like Hartlepool, which I know well, I come off a council estate, I've got a pretty good idea what working class people think too, is that though Labour did a brilliant job of rebuilding the public services, what was needed and is needed is a viable economy, jobs, businesses, industry in these communities. And that's particularly true in the northeast, which has had a really terrible 40 years now since the decline of the mass industries.
Paul, does some of this come back to Brexit? Some Labour campaigns have said it did not come up on the doorstep, but clearly it has been perhaps the point where lots of people who felt disillusioned with Labour finally made the jump.
The Labour's policy of a second referendum was electoral suicide, frankly. It was only going to end in electoral oblivion. If you look at these statistics, 50 of the 54 seats that went from Labour to the Tories at the last election voted Brexit. The idea that Labour was ever going to get away with saying to millions of working class people, actually, we think you got it wrong, we're going to make you go through the vote again, was frankly insane. It certainly isn't the only factor as to why there's been a huge disconnect between Labour and the working class, but it was a big one. And I would simply say to Andrew, look, the statistics show that Labour has been losing the working class since around about the turn of the century. You know, the C2 DEs have been voting for Labour less and less, and Labour has become more of a middle class party in terms of attracting the ABC ones. And you know, as I said, the acute effects of globalisation in some of these communities, in terms of rapid demographic change, in terms of deindustrialisation, in terms of people's sense of place and belonging being violated, cannot be overestimated. And you know, the truth is now that people in those communities look at the Labour Party, and I'm a member of the Labour Party, by the way, so it pains me to say this, but they look at a party now that is a party effectively for the professional and managerial classes, a party for student radicals, a party for Twitter, a party for social activists, a party that's rooted in the fashionable cities and the university towns. And I think that this is potentially a paradigm shift. You know, in 1983, even when Labour was crushed at the general election under Michael Foot against Margaret Thatcher, Labour managed to retain much of its working class base. That isn't happening now. I mean, this is a serious and seismic shift for the Labour Party. And unless something happens quite urgently, which goes far beyond the question of leadership, then the party will effectively relegate itself to a middle class pressure group.
Andrew, do you think Labour might just have to look at the landscape and think that if there is a realignment of politics going on, their future lies in commuter towns, in the cities, and potentially in Tory home counties? There are some encouraging results for the Labour Party when it came to the later results in the local elections.
Well, I actually agree with Paul that the moment Labour gives up being a national party, it is heading for oblivion. It's either a national party or it becomes a small pressure group. I think its history is wrong. Labour held its working class vote through all of Tony Blair's 3 elections, and indeed our problem in the 3rd election was we had a loss to the Lib Dems in the 3rd election because of Iraq, and Iraq wasn't an issue with working class voters at all. But on his point about it not being leadership, the truth is, like many political discussions, you can't be sure because we don't know what the counterfactual would be. Labour has not had an effective and popular leader since Tony Blair. Every leader we've had since, all 4 leaders we've had since, have been, as the polls show and as all of the analysis of election shows, they have all been less popular than their Tory counterpart. Gordon Brown was less popular than David Cameron. Ed Miliband was less popular than David Cameron. Theresa May was more popular, amazingly, than Jeremy Corbyn. And Boris Johnson ran rings round Corbyn in the 2019 election. So my proposition to you, which is that when Labour has had a good, effective, strong, centrist leader who's able to mobilise north and south, working class and middle class, that's led to success, is demonstrated by Tony Blair. Paul says it's not the case now. All I can say is since Tony Blair went, every leader of the Labour Party has been weaker, less effective and less nationally unifying than the Conservative leader. So it may not be a bad place to start to get a popular leader.
Andrew, I just wondered, when you mentioned obviously the party losing working class voters, do you think the Brexit position that both you and Tony Blair adopted has helped keep working class voters on side?
No, I don't actually. If you look at the votes, and indeed if you look at the Brexit vote, half of the Brexit vote was in the home counties. It wasn't in traditional working class areas at all. The big problem was that for the last 5 years, Labour has been leaderless on the issue of Europe. We had Jeremy Corbyn leading during the 2016 referendum, who was sitting on the fence, essentially. I think he made one speech in the entire campaign, and then he said he was moderately in favour of Remain, but not strongly. And of course, he then sat on the fence for the whole of the next 4 years. When you've got one party that has a clear and emphatic and well-led campaign, and you've got another party that has a weak, flabby position which is untenable in its own terms because Corbyn was facing both ways. Surprise, surprise, it's the strong leader that wins and it's the weak leader that loses, and I'm afraid...
Are you saying, Andrew, can I just intervene now? Are you saying that had Labour been more passionate about the second referendum and less, ambivalent, that actually we wouldn't have lost millions of those working class votes, that actually the way to have gone would have been to be more stridently pro-EU and more stridently in favour of blocking the referendum result, and actually the Hartlepols of this world would have stayed on board with the Labour Party. It seems to me what you're saying.
Well, again, we don't know because there wasn't a second referendum.
I think we can hazard a pretty good guess, don't you?
At the time, show that if there was a second referendum, there would have been a majority to stay in the EU. But because there wasn't the second referendum, we don't know. But if you're asking me, do I think we should have had a second referendum, and would the second referendum have built a new Labour coalition in alliance with the Greens and the Lib Dems and indeed the Nationalists in favour of staying in the EU, which would have marginalised the Conservatives and the Brexit Party, it is my view that that's what would have happened. It would have also
marginalised millions of working class voters, Andrew. It would also have marginalised our core vote.
We would have won, is the point, and that builds a new core vote. But unfortunately, we had Jeremy Corbyn. We didn't have the second referendum. Instead, we had Boris Johnson, who got to a second election before a second referendum, and the election was a choice between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, and that was a film that only ever had one ending, I'm afraid.
I think it would be an utter betrayal of the Labour Party's entire purpose to say, actually, what we really need to do is to build a new coalition around young people, people in the cities, graduates, people who are pro-EU, in alliance with the Greens and the Lib Dems, and that's our new base. Actually, the reason the Labour Party was set up in the first place, as you know, was to represent the voiceless in society, the people living in the poorer parts of our nation, the people in industrial communities like Hartlepool. And the idea that because we couldn't carry them over the idea of a second referendum, well, we should just write them off and concentrate on a new base, I think really would be a betrayal of everything we're supposed to stand for in the movement. But you may not be what you said, Andrew, but that would be the logical conclusion of what...
No, it's not. It's neither what I said, nor is it the conclusion. It's my view that if we'd been more successfully led, we would have been able to build a coalition that included the Lib Dems, the Greens, and the working class in communities like
around the demand for a second referendum.
It's because we were badly led that we were unable to do that, and that's the reason why Boris Johnson, preposterously, is now the champion of the working class in Hartlepool.
Andrew, do you think with hindsight perhaps the mistake Labour made was not to support Theresa May's Brexit deal? There has been the point made that had they done so, the Tory party would be divided, potentially imploding, and you could have kept on to some of those voters who had voted for Brexit but also backed Labour.
No, the mistake in hindsight was to elect Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour Party leader in 2015 and then to allow him to fight a second election in 2019. Whenever the British people were faced with a choice as who they wanted as Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn was on the ballot paper, they were always going to go for the Conservative. Even a Conservative as weak as Theresa May at the end of the 2017 election was significantly more popular than Jeremy Corbyn. And Boris Johnson was head and shoulders above Jeremy Corbyn by the end of the 2019 election, both as a leader but also on economic policy, which is the most important policy that people fight elections on, where Labour's £1 trillion nationalisation programme, which by the way would have offered working class voters in the north almost nothing in terms of better public services or better jobs, that was again always going to end in disaster. It's because Labour hasn't been able to find a good leader since Tony Blair that we're in this mess. Until we put this right, I'm afraid we'll continue in it.
Well, thank you, Paul and Andrew. Now, there was one standout performance from Labour, Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester. He increased his majority by 100,000 votes. So what can Starmer learn from him? Can that success be replicated across the country? Andy, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV and congratulations on your election. So talk us through this. How have you expanded your coalition of voters at a time when the party elsewhere in England appears to be in decline?
There's a simple answer to that question, Katie. It's in taking a place-based approach, a place-first approach to how I go about my job rather than a politics-first approach. I was very clear when I left Westminster that the point scoring was kind of staying there. And in this role, it is about speaking first to the place, and place is a unifying factor, isn't it, for people of all political persuasions. Now, some listening to me now will say, well, hang on a minute, didn't you play politics in the middle of last year over Tier 3? Well, no, because I said all along that where the government gets it right, I will say so. But where they get it wrong equally, I will say so, and I'll do it as forcefully as I can. And, I think people saw what I was doing and responded to it. So I would say it's about place first, and party comes after that. And that, I think, kind of speaks to people of all political persuasions. And I am, incredibly humbled by the fact that in every ward in Greater Manchester, I achieved a majority. And I think that says something that people are buying into that approach, hopefully, but also they're buying into Greater Manchester devolution. They like the idea of us being able to do more for ourselves. They like the idea of Greater Manchester and the North having a stronger voice. And I think they want the government to go further on devolving more powers to Greater Manchester.
And you talked about devolution in your victory speech, but I wondered if also, if we're looking at trends from the local elections, one of the things is, generally speaking, perhaps unless something had gone very wrong, incumbents seem to do fairly well. So do you think you benefited from that to a degree, the fact that you were the incumbent and restrictions are easing?
I think so. Obviously, it's been a time when leaders regionally and nationally have been in the spotlight, and we've all had tough calls to make through the pandemic. And I think people have kind of tuned into what we're doing and have obviously seen us as a voice for their part of the world through this difficult time. But I think more broadly, I think these were devolution elections. I think the public are saying, yeah, we didn't know whether mayors would be a thing in 2017 when you were first all elected, but actually now we can really see the value of you. And I think the pandemic has really brought home the value to people. And it's not just obviously English devolution that is becoming established through these elections. I think you can look at Wales, where Labour historically, I think, has had a more positive approach there with very much playing to the Welsh identity. And I think that was rewarded, and Mark Drakeford's approach to the pandemic. So I do think that's what's coming through. I think there was a question mark about whether or not mayors and devolution in England would become established and would be supported by the public. But I would say these elections demonstrate very, very forcibly that is what people want more of.
And in that post-mortem, which has been going on, there's lots of theories going through the rounds as to why Labour struggled in other parts of England and, across the United Kingdom more generally. Though, as you say, Welsh Labour was, a success, really. I wondered, when you're talking about things like devolution, also talking about the success of Welsh Labour, do you think the party, in terms of the main message, I suppose, can often be too focused on cultural issues rather than, I suppose, economic leftism? Do you think that that's a potential problem? Are
you talking about, in some ways, the culture wars?
Yeah.
Issues? Yeah, yes, I think there is something here that Labour needs to think about, because sometimes I think when we're dealing with issues of inequality, I made the point at the weekend that actually to speak passionately about the unfairness of social care pay is actually to speak up for fairer pay for women, largely because obviously the social care workforce is largely women. But to speak in that way is more unifying message for the country, because everybody will respond to that. But if you just talk about women's pay in the abstract, low-paid men will say, well, who's speaking for me? And I think sometimes, approaching things through that way often can see, it doesn't feel like a unifying message sometimes. And I do think there's something there for the party to think about. How does it, talk to everybody in a more unifying way?
And when it comes to Keir Starmer, there's lots of people putting their opinions out there on his leadership. Jeremy Corbyn has suggested there's a weakness in suggesting that some of these results are, the legacy of him. And Ed Miliband, a different Labour leader, has said that it's too early to blow the whistle on Keir Starmer's leadership. I wondered, of those two former Labour leaders, which do you agree with in terms of their statements?
Well, I would agree with Ed, but I'd probably say it in a slightly different way. I don't think the job has started in earnest yet, because, Keir has come into a very difficult situation where he couldn't be a normal leader of the opposition. Obviously, he's had a challenging time being pitched into the middle of a national crisis, and anybody, I think, would have found that a difficult thing to judge in terms of what level of opposition, what level of support, and I think he's handled it carefully and quite well. But it has definitely restricted his ability to project his own style to the country. So I would say in some ways the job is really starting now, and Keir has an opportunity now to set out his stall in a much more direct way as leader of the opposition, and being able to oppose a bit more than maybe he's felt able to in the really tough moments of the crisis last year.
And has Keir managed to reach out to you to congratulate you? Have you spoke since your result came in?
I've certainly had a very nice message off Keir. We haven't spoken directly, but he did come to Manchester the week before polling day, and I certainly welcomed his visit. And as I say, I think he's in a position now where the results were mixed. I think they were kind of portrayed early on as though they were bad results, and there were certainly bad results within it, no doubt about that. But they were a little more mixed, and there are positives for him in these results to pick up. But for what it's worth, my advice would be, firstly, support English devolution. Look at what Labour in power is doing and feed off that, both in Wales and here in Greater Manchester, Steve Rotherham in Liverpool, and also give full support to Tracy as the country's first woman Metro Mayor. That's a great story for the party. And the other thing I would say is, maybe paint things more in primary colours rather than sometimes the nuance that we see from Labour, the caution that we see from Labour. Opposition, I think, has to be done in that way. Bolder strokes in primary colours, and I think that's where I think things need to go. A clear sense of Labour's priorities going forward. Define levelling up. There's an opportunity, isn't there, for the Labour Party? Levelling up, let's be fair to the Prime Minister, he has finally brought us to a point where the country is focusing on the right issue at the top of the political agenda. Regional inequalities have been neglected by everybody for as long as I can remember, but finally they are at the top of the political agenda. But the problem is it hasn't yet been properly defined as to what the government means by it. And there was this phrase knocking around last week that there was, quotes, widespread cluelessness within the government about it. Well, that creates an opportunity for a Labour version of levelling up to be set out that is very much more about people rather than infrastructure. And I would certainly encourage Keir into that territory.
Yeah, I suppose there's a risk in a way that if you wait for Boris Johnson to define levelling up, it leaves Labour behind. So now could be the time for Keir Starmer to really try and get on the front foot by doing that.
Yes, I think so. I think the government will increasingly define it, but I'm not sure yet that it will be a definition that people will support, because there is a feeling still that it's about favouring some places rather than others. So levelling up could be quite divisive, actually. It's certainly sort of starting to shape up in that way.
So just finally, you have a new London-based column for the Evening Standard announced this week. We've heard a lot from you about obviously leaving the Westminster bubble and not being a metropolitan elite. So I wondered, what did you always want to have a column in a London free sheet? Is this a dream for you?
No, I couldn't have imagined really the circumstances in which it would have happened. But they made an approach to me. It was about a couple of months ago. And I kind of was a bit surprised to get it, but I think it reflects a feeling in London, doesn't it, that it needs to engage in the levelling up debate. London needs to sort of get involved here and not just feel like they're being talked about by everybody else and London is sitting there alone. So I kind of thought, well, actually, it's a good move from the Standard, because, and from my point of view, I need to reach out back to the Standard and say, well, okay, let me explain a bit more why we feel. When you can hear a little bit of that anger in our voice about things like the cost of transport, let me just explain why. And if I explain why, I think the vast majority of people in London will say, okay, now we understand why they're going on about it so much. So I see this as an opportunity to build a coalition of support around levelling up. and actually get London as an ally in this whole enterprise. The problem is, not the problem, because I understand the way the media works. I hadn't expected the Standard to announce it in the aftermath of the election sort of inquest, and it immediately looked like this was some sort of leadership play from me, which I can assure you, Katie, it absolutely is not. It's an attempt to reach out to London to explain how things seem to us here, and to tell the readers of the London Evening Standard that actually I quite love London, really, because I've spent a lot of my life there, and my son was born there and he's studying at university there. So it may be perceived that I'm become very anti-London. I can assure them, I'm going to be assuring the Standard readers I'm not. I just want Greater Manchester to have what London has got.
Yeah, because as you say, some have read it as you parking your tanks on Starmer's lawn, and you're saying that's not the case. But did you give Keir Starmer a heads up before you accepted the column job?
No, I didn't. And as I say, I accepted this quite a while ago, way before the election. So that hopefully that proves that this was for the reasons I've just explained to you. But I didn't. And I do want to make a point here about what I'm doing. I don't run things by the Labour HQ or the leader's office, because devolution can't work like that. I think I got the vote that I got because I'm doing things free from all of that stuff that goes on in Westminster, and that gives you the authenticity, I think. I keep saying it, I'm just so much more happy in this job than I ever was when I was in Westminster, just because I feel I can be myself. I'm in the place that I love with the people that I love, and we're doing things to benefit them, and it's energising, and it's fantastic. Devolution, actually, this is the thing about it. It is actually the route to getting people back in touch with politics, I think. It does allow us to do politics differently. I don't think doing the same that Westminster does and just waiting for people to buy back into it, I just don't think that's going to work. I think Labour particularly has to come back at this reconnection thing from a completely different direction, and devolution of power in England offers that different direction. So no, I very much don't run what I do by the leader's office. In the same way, if you may remember, the Scottish Labour Party was often accused of being a branch office, and I think that played a part in really hurting Labour in Scotland. Well, devolution works if it's really truly bottom up, and it's not, no one's giving you orders to do what you do, and I very much hold true to that.
Thank you, Andy. Now to Scotland. In this week's cover piece, the Spectator's editor Fraser Nelson wonders whether Sturgeon really wants to have a second referendum now, despite what she might say publicly. To discuss, I'm joined now by Fraser, as well as our political editor James Forsyth. Fraser, in this week's cover piece, you say that Unionists are actually in a pretty good position. But if we look at that result, the SNP are just one short of a majority. So why is that?
Well, the SNP is very good at telling stories, and the story Nicola Sturgeon has got for the world right now is that Scotland is a kind of country straining at the leash of the Union, all set to have another referendum. And if you hear the language the SNP is using now, that they were complaining that there wasn't a referendum bill in the Queen's speech, for example, that would set the legislation for the next year. But if you actually then rewind and say, on what basis is Nicola Sturgeon making this point? The opinion polls show that independence, while a bit more popular last autumn, has now gone back to the kind of support that we'd seen in 2014 referendum. About 44% of Scots would like to leave the UK. And also, Sturgeon herself, the SNP won fewer seats than it did 10 years ago. So we've seen a kind of decade of stagnation in SNP support. Now, she told us that Brexit would mean that people would be all set to leave the UK. Well, that hasn't happened. The Brexit vote hasn't helped the SNP vote at all. Boris Johnson, supposedly hated in Scotland, doesn't seem to have had much of a negative impact. The Scottish Tories got the same vote share as they did in the last Scottish election. So we've seen the SNP with a lot of things that should move the dial for them simply haven't. So Nicola Sturgeon is engaged in this rather ingenious game of bluff, wanting to tell England and the rest of the world that Scotland is ready to go. In fact, the battle she has got is not with Boris Johnson, it's with the half of Scots who are by no means persuaded that what she says is making much sense.
James, I think if we look at the SNP results, Nicola Sturgeon, as Fraser touched on, been quick to herald it as a big success for them, even a mandate for Indy Ref 2. But is the party suffering from the fact they had such high expectations and made them quite public going into the fact that to fall short of majority does look like a failure?
Yes, I think the view in Westminster and Whitehall is essentially this, which is the situation in Scotland is not great, but it is nowhere near as bad as people feared it could be last autumn. Remember, last autumn, independence was regularly ahead in the polls. Nicola Sturgeon used to tweet out poll results quite regularly. There was a sense that there was a small but definite majority in favour of independence, and the SNP looked almost a lock for a majority at Holyrood, which is a remarkable achievement in a proportionate system. So the fact that the SNP fell just short of an overall majority, and currently more polls show majority support for staying in the union rather than leaving it, is, I think, creating a certain amount of encouragement. I also think the UK government has positioned itself in a more sensible place. I think if you talk to people who've conducted focus groups in Scotland recently, they say that they think there are two sets of politicians who will get punished by electors right now in the constitutional question. One is the politician who wants to have the referendum almost immediately, and the other is the person who says kind of glibly, well, you can't have it for another 50 years. And I think the danger was at the start of the year is that Downing Street were falling into that trap. Boris Johnson was suggesting that you shouldn't have another referendum for 40 years. I think now the government is saying, look, now is not the time as you recover from a COVID pandemic. Nicola Sturgeon is having to agree with that. And I think that, you are pushing back the date. Now, I think it is certain the government won't grant a Section 30 order. And I think what you will see over the next few months is the SNP trying to kind of whip up a sense of grievance to push the numbers supporting independence up. And I think the crucial thing is that the UK government turns the cheek. Nicola Sturgeon wants lots of arguments about, she wants UK ministers saying, we'll see you in the Supreme Court if you legislate for a referendum. The UK government ministers just need to sidestep those questions.
And Fraser, I wonder, you were talking about the polls and how actually from the unionist point of view things are looking better than they did 6 months ago. Is there an argument that the UK government should just call Nicola Sturgeon's bluff, say, you know what, have your independence referendum, we think we can win it, and that way actually finally perhaps put things to bed?
So this is where I think the Tories, look, and there will be some people who would think, look, let's call her bluff. Have that referendum, let's make the case for the union. Let's move the conversation on to questions like what currency would an independent Scotland use? Nicola Sturgeon claims that she'd have a Scottish currency, in which case who would pay people's pensions? What currency would those pensions be paid in? There's so many questions that a referendum campaign would open that I think would really underline the power and the beauty and the point of the union. But then again, you could argue that the UK shouldn't be sucked into this never-ending trap, that they should not be playing the SNP's game by having a referendum whenever the SNP wants one. Personally, I'm more attracted to giving Nicola Sturgeon the referendum if she passes a vote in Parliament asking her for one. But I'm aware that there's quite a lot of unionists who think that would be a disaster and playing straight into her hands.
James, are you one such unionist?
Well, I think what you look at the election results in Scotland, and what you cannot see from them, I don't think, is an overwhelming desire to have a second independence referendum. That was a big part of the SNP platform, and they didn't get over 50% of the vote. If you look at the constituency vote, very marginally more people voted for unionist parties than parties that favour independence. If you look at the list vote, by an even thinner margin, more people voted for pro-independence parties than unionist parties. But given that the most recent referendum the last referendum was in 2014, I really fail to see that there is any kind of supermajority in favour of independence among the electorate that would justify going back on the once in a generation sense that referendum was meant to be for a generation, on the basis that you couldn't ask such a divisive and destabilising question every other day. So I don't see that these elections actually particularly strengthen the case for independence. They certainly don't suggest that there is, 60% of the Scottish public that is desperate for a referendum.
But James, what I'd like to know is if the SNP were to vote in Parliament for a referendum, what would your position be? Say no or call their bluff?
My personal view is that if the Scottish Parliament were to vote for a referendum now, based on these election results, I don't think that is a sufficient basis for a referendum.
So James, if you're opting for the say no approach in those circumstances, can you talk us through?
Tactically, I wouldn't have the UK government say no. I think it would be much better to have a private citizen challenge the law in the Court of Session. The Court of Session is a fairly conservative with a small c court, and I think it would be likely to strike the law down on the basis that the Constitution is a reserved matter.
And have you got any private citizens in mind particularly?
I don't, but Fraser says in his piece, and this chimes with what I'm hearing as well, is that there is already the kind of funding in place for that private legal challenge. And if by some quirk of constitutional law, they did manage to hold the referendum, I think a referendum held in these circumstances should be simply boycotted by unionists, because the only basis on which you could hold a referendum would be, without the consent of the UK government, would be on the basis that it had no legal effect. And I think unionists should say, look, we're not participating in a referendum that is only taking place because it has no effect.
Thank you, Fraser and James. So what of the COVID picture? Next week marks the latest unlocking. So how do the figures fare? I'm joined by Kate Andrews, our economics editor, to give us the lowdown.
Thanks, Katie. Well, all of the COVID data continues to look good, and it has done for some time now. As you can see from this first slide, cases are down by nearly 97% below the winter peak, hovering around where they were in early September. Now, I think what's notable here is if there had been a spike from reopening in schools, shops, or outdoor hospitality, you would certainly expect to see that evidence by now. And meanwhile, hospitalizations are down nearly 98% below the peak and deaths 99% below the peak. And while the numbers that we want to see plummeting are doing so, the numbers that we want to see rising are also doing so accordingly. As you can see here, the antibody data from the ONS, which comes out every 2 weeks, and today the latest set of data has been published, is looking really positive. It's not as big of a jump this time round. We found this data can stall and then surge, but they're still really exciting figures. So in England, 7 out of every 10 adults are estimated to have antibodies. It's 6 in 10 in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And of course, that now covers the most vulnerable and elderly who were prioritized to get their first vaccine. And you can see the data more clearly here when it comes to age breakdown. Some 85% of the over 50s have antibodies, while the level is closer to 95% for the over 80s. That is exactly who we would want to have protected first. And what you're seeing here is the vaccine factor in action. With COVID cases on the ground, it's clear that this immunity isn't happening through natural infection, but from jabs. So what does this mean for our economic recovery? Well, the Q1 figures were out this week, which you can see here, showing the economy contracted 1.5% in the first 3 months of the year. Now, that's not good news, so to speak, but if you consider that we were in a very strict lockdown for that entire time, that GDP fell by just 1.5% overall, once again illustrates the extent to which businesses have developed a resilience to lockdowns, especially if you compare this dip to what happened in the first lockdown last spring. In Q2, we saw the economy contracted by a staggering 19.5%, the largest fall on record. So clearly businesses are learning to handle these extremely difficult restrictions. And you have the furlough scheme, which is helping to support businesses that simply can't be open legally right now. Growth in March, which you can see on the red line, was better than predicted, as school reopenings were the only really big liberalizing event that month. And in fact, recently forecasters have been more bullish, upgrading their predictions, with the Bank of England revising its forecast up to 7% growth this year. EY, Goldman Sachs, and others have also been upping their forecasts over the past few weeks. So is it all good news? Well, as ever with this virus, any kind of optimism must be met with cautiousness as well. So far, the Prime Minister has kept to his roadmap. Those dates seem to be on track, but there has been talk over just the past 24 hours of concerns over the Indian variant of the virus, which we simply don't have much information yet about how it interacts with vaccines. And if there were to be any delay in reopenings either next week or on the 21st of June, or if major restrictions were to stay in place, like 1 meter plus rules around social distancing, that could have a major impact on the upside scenarios that I've showed you today. Back to you, Katy.
Thank you, Kate. So if the data continues in this direction, socialising appears to be back on the foreseeable. But are we ready? After months locked in our homes, are we going to run out of topics or only have to talk about COVID? In this week's magazine, Rachel Johnson sets out her new rules of post-pandemic interaction. She joins me now. Rachel, talk us through the new rules of engagement.
Yes, I can. I'd be delighted to. I think we should all stop talking about which vaccine we've had and how many episodes of it, which vaccine we've had and how we felt afterwards. I think we should all stop talking speculatively or not about whether we've had the virus, although I have to say I did used to do that myself. I think we should stop talking also, weirdly, about the variants. I think we've got to accept that the vaccine was the cavalry, it rode to the rescue. As a country, we've been saved, like Blucher at Waterloo, coming to the rescue of Wellington. And we've now got to look forward, and we've got to look outwards, away from our sofas and our sourdough, and start talking much more about things we're going to do to save the creative sector, to save the hospitality, the catering and the tourism sectors. I want people to say, I'm going to the Royal Academy to look at the Hockney, or I'm going to Paris to look at the Picasso. I'm going to go to that new restaurant that's opened in Shepherd's Bush, and just to externalize their lives a bit more and not talk about the same old topics that we have drilled down on, deep dives for over a year.
And what's the worst COVID conversation you've had over the past year?
I reserve a special displeasure for when people ask me about my children. I don't mind, and I actually welcome it when beloved grandparents, aunts, uncles, godparents make inquiries, because I know they love the people in question and they have known them since birth. But when people who have never met my children, don't know their names, ages or occupations, demand for me to kind of tweet out their CVs and go through each one's career path, I don't regard it as polite conversation. I regard it as a total waste of my time and also of their time, unless, of course, they're keeping a private tally of what other people's children are doing for their own competitive purposes. So they can compare my children to their children, say, your one's working for an app in the East End. Well, mine's been running a charity in Paris. I just think it's completely non-productive and puts me in a terrible temper.
And what about the roadmap? Should we be talking about the roadmap? Are we allowed to say June 21st? Should we be looking at the green list and talking about which countries are up or down, or is that also quite triggering?
I think that holidays are so uncertain that the only conversation you have circles back to, well, if it's on the green list, then I should be all right and I could do test and release on day 5. You can't believe it's a world of boredom. I think, was it Victor Hugo said, more terrible than the hell of suffering is the hell of boredom. And I feel that we've got to recognize this and actually sort of, stop and check ourselves before we have these conversations after we've been waiting to go out for over a year. So it's an unutterable waste when you find yourself in some pub garden and have the sort of conversation you had over Zoom during lockdown. Have you had the virus? Have you had the vaccine? Where are you going? Can you go? What about a quarantine hotel? It's too boring. We've got to stop. I mean, I know I'm boring myself having this conversation, by the way. It's not as if I'm Dorothy Parker or anybody, but I think that we just, as a nation, got to do a bit better. I'm sure they're not talking about this in Paris, even though they've got a reconfinement and they have to have an attestation to go about 5 yards from their house. I'm sure they're talking about culture and sex and fashion and food in a way that we're not.
And on the subject of sex, one of the things you say in the piece is there's been a surge in physical activity in this manner, perhaps because we are so bored of talking to each other for some of the reasons you've outlined. Do you think that could be a ripe topic for conversation?
Yes, I think so. Although I have to add, I was quite surprised when I read that Reckitt, the manufacturer of condoms, had announced a double-digit, no pun intended, rise, no pun intended, in the sales of Durexes, because I think this has been the least sexy year in human history, the pandemic of 2020 to 2021. But so my only construction I can place on this is that conversation is so boring and so limited that couples or strangers far prefer to exchange body fluids than trivia.
And have you got any big social events planned where you're going to put these new rules of engagement to the test in the coming weeks or months?
I did. I had a lovely dinner. I hope he doesn't mind me name dropping, with Johnny Bowden outside in the Ivy. And before we started dinner, I laid out the stall. I said, these are the banned topics. And so we didn't talk about the virus, the vaccine, lockdown, holidays, and we had such fun. But unfortunately, as a result, we broke all Eleanor Roosevelt's rules of conversation, which are all about how little people talk about people and big people talk about ideas. Of course, we had just a long and very pleasurable gossip, which would have had Eleanor Roosevelt turning in her grave. The whole point of going out is the exchange of gossip. I mean, you as a political journalist know that politics is essentially gossip, and many of the political stories you read in the newspapers are people exchanging gossip. And what was so dispiriting about lockdown was nobody was going out and doing anything. So gossip just dried up. And so I was like a plant that withered. And now, of course, we're watering the plant a little bit more. But we've got to be careful to water it properly so that it thrives and it's not just gossip. We've got to talk about politics, we've got to talk about foreign affairs, ideas, the wokery of the left. All these topics, these are really interesting things. So we've got to stop talking about the virus and the variants.
And finally, what's going to happen, Rachel, if you invite someone around and they fail your test and they start going on about face masks?
And children.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, don't get me started on face masks. I think that they are pretty useless and they just virtue signal that you are compliant with, the state interventions into all our lives. And, you voted for Biden. I can't wait to get rid of face masks inside, outside, and at schools and in shops. So I'm quite happy to have that conversation, actually, because I find it quite triggering. But children, Katy, maybe you can help me on this one. What should I say when people who don't know them ask me about my children? Because I'm trying to work out a non-aggressive way of responding to that question.
I think if they don't know your children, you could just say you don't have children and see what happens.
That's a really good idea. I'll try it.
Thank you, Rachel. Now, finally, let's go across the channel to France. Former Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier thinks he's in for a shot at the presidency, but not everyone else is so sure. Among his pitch is an idea to stop immigration from outside the EU for up to 5 years. So does he stand a chance? Jonathan Miller says not, in a piece for the Spectator's website this week. He joins me now with Freddie Gray, the Spectator's deputy editor. Jonathan, the French presidential election continues to get underway, but can you talk us through this new entrant? Introduce us to the man, Michel Barnier.
Well, Michel Barnier is one of these guys who doesn't need a lot of introduction, especially not to the British, because he was the chief negotiator of the European Union through the whole Brexit saga. And he's now apparently decided that he can serve his country by returning and possibly making a bid for the presidency, which is a little bit interesting. We're not that interesting because I think he has absolutely no chance. I think the only people who are really interested in Michel Barnier these days are the Brits.
Freddie, do you think that's fair? Are you interested in Michel Barnier? He has received plenty of criticism, particularly from the UK press during the negotiations, but Nigel Farage has praised him.
I'm not particularly interested in Michel Barnier. I do think it's interesting that he felt his way to make a splash in the presidential race was to declare a stop on immigration for the French, which is obviously very rich given the Brexit negotiations and all the arguments about free movement and so on. But I think, as Jonathan says in his excellent piece for us, that I can't really see this campaign going anywhere.
Well, Jonathan, what's the point of this campaign then? Because, as you say in your piece, he's not really registering in any polls. Do you think Barnier thought he'd do better, or is it something else that he's trying to achieve here?
I think there's a kind of, he's in Brussels. He was kind of exiled to Brussels about 10 years ago, where he's been a kind of grey man, a fonctionnaire, a master of dossiers. His work is kind of done in Brussels. Macron doesn't really like him. He's kind of the right. He's 70. He feels pretty good. He thinks he can come back and maybe re-establish some kind of political career in France. I doubt that even in his wildest fantasies he imagines he's going to be president, but possibly he can talk himself into a ministerial role in some new government and collect another pension on top of the half dozen I imagine he already has.
And Jonathan, how is the campaign looking more generally, the broader picture? What about Macron, the incumbent?
Well, see, I think this is the campaign that keeps on giving as far as journalists are concerned, because every day there's a new little mini drama. Macron is, I think he's lost in cloud cuckoo land. He's talking about the future of the EU, but that's not really what people in France are talking about. They're talking about security. We've had 2 more policemen, a policewoman and a policeman, assassinated on the streets of France in the last few days. We've had constant videos night after night from various parts of France where people are throwing, fireworks at the police and setting fire to police cars. We see videos of women being pushed down the steps of the Paris metro. And people, I think, all the polls are pretty well agreed. People are interested in security, and Macron has no answers to that problem.
Freddie, talk us through these letters from the military on Islam.
Well, I think it shows just how bad things have got in France. There are some generals among military sources that I've spoken to, there are some generals who are considered a little bit too political already, but certainly there's a feeling that the generals that spoke out in the first letter warning that France could be descending into a state of civil war, there's a lot of public support for it, and there's a lot of support within the military, because there is a feeling in France that a lot of the towns in France, a lot of the cities are out of control. There are a lot of places where law and order does not dare to tread, and that's quite a dire situation. And so the generals felt compelled to make this statement with Macron. And it was interesting, actually. Macron was smart enough in his response to the first letter not to go nuclear. He didn't actually go on the offensive. The signs are his government are going a little bit more aggressively against this second letter from the soldiers. But I think that a sort of potential clash between the president and the French military, it's not out of the question. And that's how dire things are getting in France.
Well, I read the other day in this that the police are also, there's a police letter as well to current soldiers and retired soldiers, and one of these letters makes reference to 600 parts of France where the police don't really want to go. I mean, I thought it was 20 or 30, 600 neighborhoods they want to stay out of. That is, pretty dire.
Well, I was very interested, Jonathan, that you wrote a brilliant piece for us recently about Eric Zemmour running for president, this sort of possible campaign and how successful he could be if he ran. And just to explain to viewers, he's a sort of TV intellectual in France of the right. And I noticed that the magazine behind these letters is edited by a young Frenchman who actually wrote a novel in which Zemmour is cast as the saviour of, or not the saviour of France, as someone who becomes president of France. Do you think that fiction might be playing out in reality?
Well, it's very hard to know. Zemmour is an interesting guy. He's very, very, very brilliant. Even people who voted for Marine Le Pen are kind of fed up with her because she's putting on such a feeble effort despite everything. Zemmour hasn't announced whether he's going to go or not. There's no doubt that Zemmour has enemies on the left in France who will use the kind of the mood of Me Too or Balance ton porc to attack him for his what appears to have been a pretty active French life in his past. I don't know whether he'll go or not. He needs money. He needs organisation. Could he see off Marine Le Pen? It's hard to know. The situation is so confused. I mean, Barnier, who we started out talking about Barnier, the question hasn't even been asked in the mainstream polls. Would you vote for Barnier? And on the long list of the betting odds, which has got about 40 or 50 names on it, his name doesn't even feature. I asked my normal focus group at the Bar Rex is suspended as a result of the lockdown at the moment, but I've been asking people that I meet at the market on the street, what do you think of Barnier? And there's like a look of incomprehension. Nobody's even heard of him. As for the rest of the race, it's so dynamic and in such a state of flux that nobody honestly can say what's going to happen, except that there seems to be this kind of growing belief that somehow, despite everything, Marine Le Pen could potentially beat Emmanuel Macron in some kind of Donald Trump moment when the French finally say we've had enough of immobilisme, of just going nowhere for 40 years.
Fred, you've got a reputation in the Spectator office as a betting man. Who's your money on when it comes to this rather confusing race?
I think it has to still be on Macron. He is the favourite in the betting markets, which I have looked at. I have kept an eye on, believe it or not. And I think the reason he has to be the favourite is that he's blessed. Like Boris Johnson, he is blessed with terrible opponents. Le Pen obviously is in a very strong position, but she's not coming across well. She's had fallouts with various people on the right. The left is in complete shambles. Les Républicains, the centre-right, is sort of crying out for a good leader, but they seem to always murder each other. But of course, unlike Boris Johnson, Macron is very unpopular and not loved in any way. So I think despite his terribleness as a president in many ways, he's seen as this sort of posing figure. Again, to go back to the army thing, he did this ridiculous stunt where he wore a pilot flight suit like George Bush did in Iraq. And it was seen as a sort of appalling breach of etiquette in France. And yet he did it, and he's seen as this ridiculous figure. But nobody seems capable of mounting a successful challenge or even a very good tactical one.
Well, I agree with everything you're saying. I agree that on the odds that Macron would still be a slight favourite, but it's not impossible that he could be deposed by Le Pen. What is shocking, really, is that none of them have got any kind of project or leadership or ideas for leading France to a better place. Macron was elected having this project, none of which, in fact, he's implemented, and his clumsy manoeuvres, stimulating the Gilets jaunes and making promises he's broken to the environmentalists, now cozying up to the right, declaring this ineffective war on Islam. But his project seems to be more Europe, and I have to tell you that doesn't cut much Grey Poupon mustard at the Café de la Paix here in the corner of our village. People are more interested when their kids who they've sent away to university call them up at 1 o'clock in the morning and say, I was walking home and I just got mugged and my iPhone has been stolen. And I think that's the cut through, and that is where Macron's very vulnerable. Having said that, Marine Le Pen has no vision really to offer France. The socialists are sort of led by this kind of Mélenchon, who is really almost a comic figure. The Republicans are trying to do deals with La République En Marche to try to get some kind of representation in the forthcoming departmental regional elections. The country's in a very, very tender place at the moment. I don't think it's on the verge of a coup d'etat, but it is on the it's in the middle of something resembling a nervous breakdown.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Freddie. And that's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe to The Spectator's YouTube channel so you never miss an episode again? Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video. And thank you for watching. Do join us again next week.